I'm here again with politics, religion, and coffee. I've got a piping hot cup of coffee and I'm going to take a sip of right here. And tonight we're going to go over the Bidens just a little bit. There are people who have done more extensive research than me, but I think I may have found something very important. Now, it's not illegal, what I've found, but it is corruption, in my opinion. I'll let you decide that when we get there. I'm going to save that for the end because many Republican franchises or publications have pointed out some of the things that I'm getting ready to point out now. Some of them forget to mention some of the things that I'm going to point out now, and I don't do that. I don't trust politicians. If somebody says something about a Democrat that is wrong, I will point it out. If somebody says something about a Republican that is wrong, I will point it out if I know about it. I don't trust any of them, but that's just me. This first part may step on some toes. If you're a hardline Republican, you may not want to listen to this. Hunter Biden was on the payroll of a bank named MBNA. During this time, this was 1995. During this time, 96, excuse me, 1996, during this time, there was a lot of bankruptcies on the rise, and the MBNA began pushing hard to reform a law to make it harder for people to discharge debt. In 2001, Hunter Biden transitioned full-time to a federal lobbyist, though he stayed on the payroll of MBNA and was a consultant until 2005, when President George W. Bush signed Biden's Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act into law. It was a savage piece of legislation, and Joe Biden even worked to block an amendment that would have offered bankruptcy protection to people with medical debt. The bill also blocked people from discharging private student loan debt under bankruptcy. The student loan debt was under $400 billion in 2005. It surged in the wake of the law's passage and is now over $1.5 trillion. Let's talk about that Medicare reform. Do you want to? Let's talk about giving everybody insurance. That's interesting. How about this? Let's talk about student loan forgiveness. Let's talk about why the student loan is so high to begin with. You see, I'm just setting the stage. It's amazing to me that somehow somebody was on the board of a bank that wanted to block people from being able to discharge student loan debt through bankruptcy. And all of a sudden, somebody's dad, along with President George W. Bush, signed legislation that allowed them to do just that. It's pretty amazing stuff. Don't know how that happened. Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to see here. Let's move on. Now, you might remember we talked yesterday about the bailout. This is why I wanted to talk about the bailout yesterday. There was a expose in the Washington Examiner that I talked about yesterday, and it talked about how Joe Biden's son got money from TALF. And we talked about TALF yesterday. We talked about how it was a small business loan, or was supposed to be, or to help struggling businesses. If we read this little excerpt here, so Alana Goodman in today's Washington Examiner reports that Joe Biden's son Hunter was associated with a firm that received more than $130 million in financial bailout funds. The firm was called Rosemont Capital. It then set up a fund that was incorporated in the Cayman Islands, presumably for the purpose of avoiding U.S. taxes. Wow. Let's tax the rich. Let's go ahead and do that. You want to? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. When are we going to start taxing the Bidens? Or the Sanders? Or the George Bushes? Or the Donald Trumps? When's that going to happen? I found something really interesting also on WikiLeaks I wanted to show you. This was to John Podesta from the Washington Post. Okay? And here's an interesting read. This is what, that has a lot of stuff. Not really for sure when this was, but it was pretty early. Here's one. New York Times, Joe Biden, his son, and the case against the Ukrainian oligarch by James Risen. When Vice President Biden traveled to Kiev, Ukraine on Sunday for a series of meetings with the country's leaders, one of the issues on his agenda was to encourage a more aggressive fight against Ukraine's rampant corruption. We can keep going with that. I don't want to go into any more of that, but I do want to come down here. It says, Jeffrey Pyatt went on to call for an investigation into misconduct of the prosecutors who wrote the letters. In his speech, the ambassador did not mention Hunter Biden's connection to Burisma, but Edward C. Chow, who follows Ukrainian policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said the involvement of the vice president's son with Mr. Zlochevsky's firm undermined the Obama administration's anti-corruption message in Ukraine. Now, what Mr. Chow found, I think, is something that I wanted to point out to you tonight. And I think this pretty much seals the deal. We can sit here and talk about this all night long. You can watch Tucker Carlson talk about it. You can watch CNN talk about it. Of course, they'll downplay it. But there's one thing that everybody is missing here. Okay. This is the one thing that I just put together. And I'm going to move down here and show you my little timeline. This is the Burisma timeline. In 2014, Ukrainian revolution began on Tuesday, February the 18th. It ended on Sunday, February the 23rd. Tuesday, 22nd, April 2014, Vice President Biden pledges $50 million to Ukraine in aid from the U.S., including $11 million to help with the presidential election in Ukraine. I'm just going to pause there and throw in an aside. If you don't think that $11 million was to help one candidate or another, the one that we wanted, you might be lying to yourself. That's my opinion. You make up your own mind. I did not deep dive into that, and I probably won't. Biden also announced an additional $8 million in non-lethal military assistance for the Ukraine armed forces, including bomb disposal equipment, communications gear, and vehicles. There's also a rumor that he may have said to the Ukrainian government, if you will investigate corruption, I will send you non-lethal military assistance. Okay? You look that up for yourself. You can find it. And by the way, all these links will be in the description, except for my own timeline. I'm not going to send that. This is the kicker right here. In April 2014, after the Ukrainian Revolution, Biden joined the board of Burisma Holding. In April. So Tuesday the 22nd, April 2014, Biden visits Ukraine. He promises aid. $50 million, $11 million, $8 million. Okay. Then that same month, Hunter Biden joins the board of Burisma Holdings. I put a little note down here. Looks as though old dad bought somebody's way in. Now that's not technically illegal, I suppose, unless you think using your political ties to get your son a job is politically motivated. And you might say, well, you don't have any proof that Joe Biden called anybody or said anything to anybody and said, hey, give my son a job. Probably not. Probably didn't do that. Didn't have to. Think about it for a second. Do you see the name Biden after they just gave you $50 million from the U.S.? You're going to hire that person. Plain and simple. Nothing has to be said. It's corruption. It's corruption down to the very core. And there's a long line of it. And you should look through my links in the description, because the people that wrote some of the articles that I showed you earlier are not Republican fans. These are Democrats. These are people who identify with the Democratic Party. That's not the only reason that we shouldn't vote for Joe Biden. I just wanted to point out that some of the things that have been mentioned by various other people, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, and things of that nature, they really give us an inside look into what goes on in Washington. Excuse me. What it says to me is there's a possibility that if you are a politician, your family will get taken care of just because of the name. That's pretty much the definition of nepotism. And there's a list out there. You can look it up yourself of what they call political families. I've known this for years, or I felt like this for years. Maybe it's impossible for us to ever get to a point where somebody's family member doesn't get a job because of their name. It's just unlikely that it's ever going to happen to you and I. And there's the problem. There's a political class in the United States. Okay? It's almost something you're born into. Now, you and I could, if we wanted to, be dishonest, go to Washington and possibly get elected. But are you going to be able to beat out the Bidens of this world, the Pelosi's of this world, the Kennedys of this world, the Bushes of this world, and win against them when you're a nothing nobody with no money? I doubt it. I doubt it. These are political dynasties. These are the things that George Washington fought against in the American Revolution. These are the things that our founding fathers warned us against. This is the reason nobody wants to talk about the founding fathers, because they saw this kind of stuff happening. They saw it coming. They'd seen it before in England under the rule of King George. So say what you will, say what you want. You know, there's a lot of weird stuff going on out there, and I think people are missing the point. And when you do searches about this, it's almost as if at first the mainstream media is like, oh no, there's nothing to see here. And then when people start dragging out the evidence, they turn around and say, oh, well, there's a lot to see here. This is blah, 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 and that's blah, blah, blah. And so I look for this to be more and more in the news. And when people start connecting the dots, it's the look. It's not the actual illegality of it, but it's the look of it, which is fine. I'm not doing this to smear Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. Joe Biden's beating himself. The Democratic Party beat themselves with their selection of people to run. They can't find an honest politician to run. Not that the Republicans can't either. They can at least find one that looks like he's honest. Not necessarily talking about Trump. Just saying. Okay? So this is what you got. And I'm glad you listened in to a little bit of politics, religion, and coffee. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my coffee, enjoy the rest of my night. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoyed the new intro. Have a happy night, folks. Bye.